He was rejected from art school. He slept in homeless shelters. He sold postcards on street corners just to eat. And within 15 years, this same man had absolute control over one of the most powerful nations on earth. This is not a story about a monster who appeared from nowhere. This is a story about a broken system, a desperate population, and a man who understood, better than almost anyone around him, how to turn chaos into power. This is the story of how Adolf Hitler rose from complete obscurity to become the dictator of Germany. And it is one of the most important and most disturbing stories of the 20th century. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small town on the border between Austria and Germany. His childhood was not remarkable. His father, Alois, was a customs official, strict, domineering, and frequently absent from his son's inner life. His mother, Clara, was devoted to him, and her death from breast cancer in 1907, when Hitler was 18 years old, devastated him in a way that those who knew him said never fully healed. Hitler had dreams of becoming an artist. He applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts twice. He was rejected both times. The rejection stung him deeply. And rather than pursue a different path or a different city, he stayed in Vienna, drifting. He lived in men's hostels. He ate at charity soup kitchens. He sold hand-painted postcards of Vienna's landmarks to tourists for small amounts of money. Vienna in the early 1900s was a city crackling with political tension. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was fraying at the edges. Nationalist movements were rising across its territories. Anti-Semitism, the organized hatred of Jewish people, was not a fringe position in Vienna at this time. It was mainstream. The city's mayor, Karl Lueger, had built his political career explicitly on anti-Jewish sentiment and won enormous popular support for it. The young Hitler absorbed all of this. He read pamphlets. He attended political meetings. He listened to demagogues in public squares. The ideas he would later weaponize to devastating effect: extreme German nationalism, racial hierarchy, the targeting of Jewish people as scapegoats for social and economic problems, he encountered and internalized during these Vienna years, before the First World War had even begun. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Hitler volunteered immediately for the German army. He was not German, he was Austrian, but he felt a fierce identification with Germany and German culture that Austria had never given him. He served as a messenger on the Western Front, a dangerous job that required running communications between positions under fire. He was wounded twice. He was awarded the Iron Cross, First Class, for bravery, a significant decoration. The war gave Hitler something he had never had before: purpose, belonging, and a role that he felt matched his self-image. He thrived in the military structure in a way he had never thrived in civilian life. And when Germany surrendered in November 1918, the effect on him was catastrophic. Germany's defeat in the First World War was the pivot on which everything that followed turned. The terms imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 were brutal. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war, the famous War Guilt Clause. It was required to pay enormous reparations to the Allied powers. It lost significant territory. Its military was reduced to a shadow of its wartime strength. For the German population, the shock of defeat was compounded by the humiliation of the treaty's terms. Many Germans had believed, right up until the surrender, that Germany was winning the war, or at least fighting to a draw. The sudden defeat was incomprehensible, and into that incomprehension stepped a convenient explanation, a lie that would prove catastrophically durable. The lie was called the stab-in-the-back myth. It claimed that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield. The German army, the story went, had been on the verge of victory when it was betrayed from within, by politicians, by communists, and above all, by Jewish people working against Germany's interests from inside the country. The army had been stabbed in the back by traitors. This was completely false. Germany had been genuinely defeated militarily. Its armies were exhausted, its supply lines broken, its allies collapsing. But the myth was seductive because it offered an explanation that preserved German pride and provided an enemy to blame. It spread rapidly through German political culture, and Hitler became one of its most passionate and effective promoters. After the war, Hitler stayed in Munich and began attending political meetings on behalf of the German military, which was monitoring radical political groups for signs of communist influence. In September 1919, he was sent to observe a small group called the German Workers' Party. He went expecting to observe. He ended up joining. The German Workers' Party was tiny, a few dozen members meeting in the back rooms of Munich beer halls. But Hitler discovered something in those meetings that changed the direction of his life. He could speak. He could hold a room. He could take the anger and confusion and wounded pride of the people around him and give it shape and direction and a target. This was not a small thing. Hitler's ability as a public speaker was, by the accounts of people who heard him in these early years, genuinely extraordinary. He understood crowd psychology intuitively. He knew how to build emotion slowly, how to use silence, how to escalate from grievance to fury to a kind of ecstatic shared certainty. People who came to his early speeches skeptical often left as converts. The party's membership began to grow. By 1921, Hitler had taken control of the party, which had been renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. He surrounded himself with men whose skills complemented his own. Ernst Röhm organized the paramilitary wing, the Sturmabteilung, the SA, known as the Brown Shirts, who provided muscle, intimidated political opponents, and gave the movement a sense of military discipline and force. Hermann Göring, a decorated First World War flying ace, brought social credibility and connections to the conservative establishment. Joseph Goebbels, whom Hitler met slightly later, brought a genius for propaganda and mass communication that would eventually make him one of the most effective manipulators of public opinion in modern history. By 1923, the Nazi Party had grown significantly. Germany was in crisis. The reparations payments required by the Treaty of Versailles had contributed to a hyperinflationary economic collapse of almost unimaginable proportions. In 1923, the German mark lost so much value so quickly that workers were paid twice a day, so they could spend their wages before the money lost its value. People carried banknotes in wheelbarrows. Life savings were wiped out entirely. The middle class, the people who had worked their entire lives to achieve stability, were economically annihilated. Hitler, watching the chaos, decided the moment had come. On the night of November 8, 1923, he and a group of armed followers stormed a political meeting in a Munich beer hall and announced the beginning of a national revolution. The next day, Hitler led a march through Munich, expecting the police and military to join them and sweep the existing government from power. They did not join. The police opened fire. 16 Nazis and 4 police officers were killed. Hitler was arrested. The beer hall putsch, as it became known, was a complete failure as a coup, but it became something else, a platform. At his trial, Hitler turned the proceedings into a political performance. He gave lengthy, passionate speeches that were reported widely in German newspapers. He presented himself not as a criminal, but as a patriot who had acted to save his country. The judge, sympathetic to the nationalist cause, gave him the minimum sentence of 5 years. He served less than 9 months. In prison, Hitler dictated a book to his deputy, Rudolf Hess. He called it Mein Kampf, My Struggle. The book laid out, in considerable detail, his ideology, his view of history as a racial struggle, his contempt for democracy, his obsessive hatred of Jewish people, and his vision of a German empire stretching across Eastern Europe. It was not a subtle document. It stated, explicitly, what Hitler intended to do. Many people did not take it seriously. They would pay for that failure of imagination. When Hitler was released from prison in December 1924, Germany had stabilized economically. The crisis atmosphere that had fueled the Nazis' early growth had eased. The party's fortunes faded. In the 1928 elections, the Nazis received just 2.6% of the vote. A marginal party, seemingly in decline. Then the world economy collapsed. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 triggered a global depression of devastating scale. Germany, whose fragile economic recovery had been built partly on American loans, was hit with particular force. Unemployment in Germany rose from 1.3 million in 1929 to over 6 million by 1932. Roughly 1 in 3 German workers out of a job. Banks failed. Bassines closed. Families who had survived the hyperinflation of 1923 now faced a Second economic catastrophe within a decade, the Weimar Republic. The democratic government established after the First World War had never been fully accepted by large portions of the German population. It had been born in defeat and associated with the humiliation of Versailles. Its governments had struggled with economic instability, political violence from both left and right, and the fundamental challenge of building democratic culture in a country with no democratic tradition. Now, with unemployment at catastrophic levels and the government appearing unable to act decisively, the Republic's legitimacy collapsed. Germans began looking to the extremes, to the Communist Party on the left and to the Nazis on the right. Hitler and the Nazi Party were perfectly positioned to exploit this moment. They had spent the years of relative stability building their organization, refining their propaganda, extending their reach across Germany. When the Depression hit, they had a machine ready to deploy. The Nazi campaign of the early 1930s was sophisticated and relentless. Goebbels organized rallies of theatrical scale, torchlit processions, carefully choreographed ceremonies, the deployment of symbols and uniforms and music to create a sense of power and inevitability. Hitler flew across Germany by airplane to speak at multiple cities in a single day. An innovation in political campaigning that generated enormous attention. The image of the leader arriving from the sky had an almost mythological quality. The message was simple and consistent. Germany had been betrayed. Germany was suffering. Germany needed to be restored to greatness. The enemies responsible for Germany's humiliation, the politicians who had accepted Versailles, the communists, the Jewish people, would be dealt with. Germany would rise again. In the July 1932 elections, the Nazi Party received 37.4% of the vote, the highest they would ever receive in a free election. They were the largest party in the German parliament, the Reichstag, though not a majority. Germany's conservative political establishment made a fatal calculation. They believed that Hitler could be managed, brought into a coalition government, given a position of apparent power, while they pulled the strings behind him. They looked at this failed artist from Austria, this crude demagogue from the beer halls, and they thought they could control him. Franz von Papen, a conservative politician who became a key architect of this plan, reportedly told associates that they had hired Hitler and that within 2 months they would have pushed him into a corner so tight that he would squeak. He was catastrophically wrong. On January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. What followed was not the gradual, manageable transition the conservatives had imagined. It was a rapid, deliberate dismantling of every institution that stood between Hitler and absolute power. On February 27, 1933, less than a month after, Hitler became Chancellor. The Reichstag, building the home of the German parliament, was set on fire. A young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was found at the scene and arrested. Hitler immediately declared the fire a communist plot against the government and used it to push through the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended civil liberties across Germany. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assembly, the right to privacy. These rights were never restored. In March 1933, Hitler pushed through the Enabling Act, which gave him the power to pass laws without the approval of the Reichstag. Germany's parliament had just voted itself out of existence. Of the parties that remained in the Reichstag at that point, only the Social Democrats voted against it. Their leader, Otto Wels, gave a speech of dignified defiance that stands as one of the most courageous acts of political opposition in the record of that terrible year. It made no difference. By July 1933, all political parties other than the Nazi Party had been banned or dissolved. Germany was officially a one-party state. When President Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, making himself the supreme leader, the Führer of Germany. Members of the German military were required to swear a personal oath of loyalty not to Germany, not to the Constitution, but to Adolf Hitler personally. The rise was complete. In 15 years, Adolf Hitler had gone from sleeping in a Viennese homeless shelter to holding absolute power over a nation of 66 million people. He had done it through a combination of genuine political talent, ruthless opportunism, the exploitation of economic catastrophe, and national humiliation. The systematic dismantling of democratic institutions, and the failure of the people around him to take his stated intentions seriously until it was too late. The consequences of his rise would reshape the entire world. The Second World War would kill between 70 and 85 million people. The Holocaust would murder 6 million Jewish people and millions of others in a systematic genocide that had been outlined in disturbing clarity in the book Hitler had written in a prison cell a decade before anyone gave him power. The story of Hitler's rise is not a story about one exceptional monster. It is a story about what happens when democratic institutions are weak, when economic crisis generates mass desperation, when the truth is drowned out by simple and seductive lies, and when the people with the power to stop a dangerous man convince themselves that they can manage him instead. These are not conditions unique to Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. They are conditions that can emerge anywhere. Understanding how they produced what they produced in Germany is not a historical curiosity. It is a warning. This is Warfront Stories. If this video gave you something to think about, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. History like this matters, and we're going to keep telling it. We'll see you in the next one.